Hey guys, Danny here. Welcome back to week 11. This video is going to cover JavaScript and another framework called D3.js. This is very similar to jQuery when it comes to what a framework is. It has pre-written code and pre-written functions for us to use right away. So rather than rewriting and writing our own code to do stuff with data-driven graphics, we can use D3.js and reference our methods and functions and objects rather than creating our own. So just like with jQuery or any other framework, the best place to start is to go to the documentation website for that framework. So if you go to d3js.org, you can learn more about what D3 is, look at examples, get sample code, look at all the documentation around what the methods are and what you can do with the framework, and then also get and link to the source code for the framework. So there have been a lot of different versions of D3 over the years. One of the great things is that it's been around for so long and so many people have been using it that it's gone through a number of iterations, which has drastically improved each time it's gone through an iteration. So I personally started using D3 when it was in version 3. And they since moved on to version 4, which at the time decided to break it out into separate little libraries for different tasks or different purposes. So there's the main D3 library that you needed, but you also needed like a transition library, an axes library, scale library, to make each one of those individual elements work. I was personally not a fan of this. I just like everything in one document, especially when it comes to teaching or learning as a beginner. It's much more complicated to remember that you need to link this and the scale library and the axes library and the transition library. So luckily in the current version, which is version 5, they decided to go back to just having everything in one large file. So I understand the reason behind it. It takes a while to load the entire framework, the entire library, every time you load the web page. So it makes sense to break it apart just for loadability and speed. But for learning and for beginners, it's just overly complicated. So it's nice to have everything back into one document. So Data Visual, which is the platform that I've developed and we've been using in this class, is built off of D3. Specifically using D3 version 3. So essentially all Data Visual is a framework and a graphic user interface attached to D3. So rather than coding in D3, you can use sliders and color pickers and drop downs and very simple graphic user interface to design and build your data-driven charts and graphs. So without D3, the Data Visual would be a much larger task to build, because I would basically have to build the library, the D3 library from scratch. So Data Visual wouldn't really exist most likely, at least in the form that it currently is, without the help of the D3 framework. So some other examples that use D3 really well are the New York Times did a really great piece looking at and analyzing the Facebook initial public offering, the IPO. And comparing that to the other tech giants that have already been public. So this is all interactive. When you reload the page, everything animates in. When you hover over each element, it'll give you more information about that particular organization or corporation and what their public offering was and how they did since. So you can kind of go through this over time. So when you click next, it'll show you where Facebook was valued when it initially IPO'd. Click next. This is a logarithmic scale, so a different way of looking at it. Next. So this is the first day when it IPO'd and how it compared to all the other ones on their first day. And next, so this is 3 years later. So Facebook is still going strong, but Google has since taken the first place spot. So as you can see, there's hover states, there's interactivity, there's transitions and animation. All of this is done predominantly with D3. Here's another example that is created by Bloomberg. This is looking at the Major League Baseball statistics for the total valuation of each team. So it's broken into the team value, the regional sports network that they might be associated to, related businesses, probably like merchandising, MLB Advanced Media, which is probably royalties or something that MLB has to pay. You could hover over each one, and as you hover over it, you can see on the right, the sliders are animating to the specific position for that specific team. So let's say we wanted to compare Philadelphia Phillies. Click on Phillies, and then it shows us where the Phillies stand when it comes to revenue, receipts, concessions, sponsorship, media rights, parking, attendance, etc. Then if we hover over, let's say, the Oakland A's, it'll show how the Oakland A's stack up and rank up compared to the Philadelphia Phillies on the right-hand side. So we have a Phillies versus Oakland A's, and the revenue, pretty much everything the Phillies are knocking the A's out of the park with, except for media rights. Media rights is kind of close to each other, so those are pretty similar when it comes to the amount that they make on media rights. And again, all of this is created using D3, the animations on the sliders, the interaction on the click, and the hover states for each one of these, and the actual visualization of this like stacked radial bar chart. Another great example is pudding.cool. These guys make some really great data-driven stories. This particular one is about the most timeless songs of all time, according to Spotify's API. So as you scroll down, you can read about it and learn more about it, and then there's visualizations around different topics. So like this one is specifically on the 90s, looking at who is still popular, what bands and what songs are still popular today that were popular in the 90s. So you could hover over each one of these, learn more about who they are, the song, when it was originally released, and how many plays it's had on Spotify. And then you could also sort and filter by keywords. So let's say we just want to look at Nirvana. So if you type in Nirvana, then it'll show you and highlight all the songs that are still popular by Nirvana. So there's Lithium, Come As You Are, and by far Smells Like Teen Spirit is still being played a ton on Spotify. So all of this is being created with D3.js. When it comes to the placement of all these circles and images on this chart, as well as the filtering and the hover states, are all created with D3. Okay. How D3 works is it's basically just creating objects for scalable vector graphics in HTML, or SVGs. SVGs are vector graphics, so they can be scaled up and down and still maintain their resolution. And basically how it works is SVG is a HTML element. You can give it a width and a height, and then you could pass in different objects into this SVG element, like circles or rects or lines, etc. And then you can give these objects attributes like an X position, Y position, radius, stroke, color, stroke width, and fill. So here are some of the objects that you can play around with. So there's circle, rectangle, line, and text. And some of the attributes that you could apply to these objects are X and Y location, a fill color, a stroke color, stroke width, and then there's other CSS styles that you could apply to it as well. So just like with jQuery, you have to attach the framework to your HTML document before you could actually start using it. So that's what this is. It's sourcing where the library lives, where it exists. So once that's in there, then we could start referencing the different methods and objects that are a part of this library. We also want to create an SVG element in our HTML, given an ID, and we're basically going to push SVG objects to this element using JavaScript and D3. So why don't we first go to glitch.com and log in, and let's create a new project. We can ignore the README. Let's just go to index. So we need to get the D3 library connected to our HTML. To do that, the best thing to do is just to go to d3js.org. So this is a great website, great documentation. You should definitely go through this and look at all the different examples, look at all the documentation behind all the methods and all the different options that you have when it comes to using D3. But just on the home page, we're just getting started. It gives you the option to download the entire D3 library. If you wanted to run this locally, you can do that, but we're not going to do that. We really care about this link, this script source, which is basically hosted on the D3 servers, and then we could just reference that library, that link to the library in our HTML. So we're going to select this and copy it. Go to glitch and then paste it in our head right after the metadata. So again, this is version 5, so we're working with version 5. You have to know which version you're working with as well. So now that that's there, then we can start referencing that library, that framework, and start using the methods and the objects that come with it. So the other thing we want to do is also create a SVG element with given an ID. You could call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it chart. And this is what we're going to use using this ID, chart ID. This is what we're going to use to pass in our chart elements, like a bar chart or a line chart, pass in those lines and bars into this SVG element. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is get some data into our JavaScript file. We're just going to do a very simple array of values, and that's going to be our initial data set that we're going to be playing around with. So I'm going to create a variable, set that equal to an array of any number of values that you want. Doesn't really matter, and those values can be anything that you want as well. So let's go back to our JavaScript file, and we could just delete everything that's in there. And let's create a variable for data. Set that equal to an array of values. Doesn't really matter what they are. You can do whatever you want. Okay. All right, so let's then check this out and make sure, okay, looks good so far. So whenever you are programming in JavaScript, you always want to have your JavaScript console window open, so you can see any possible errors or potentially print any data or any information to the console, so you can see that it's working there. So let's keep that open at all times while we're programming. So the next thing I want to do is create a couple of variables for width and height. This is going to be applied to the SVG element. And then we're going to create a variable for bar height, which is going to be the height of the bar. We're going to create a simple bar chart. And then we're going to create a variable W, set that equal to a D3 object. So just like with jQuery, D3 is defined by D3. jQuery is defined by a $sign. So when you see D3, you know that we're working with D3 methods and objects. So W equals D3 dot scale linear. So this is creating the scale of our chart itself. And it's going to be a linear scale. Then we're going to add a domain for the data. And then the range is going to be a minimum of 0 and a maximum of the width of the chart. Okay, so let's add that to our JavaScript. So var width equals 420, height equals 500. Again, this could be whatever you want it to be, 500. And then bar height equals height divided by data.length. So we are going to change the bar height based off of the number of data points that are in the data set. So data.length is going to give us the total number of data points we have in here, which is going to be 6. Then we're going to create another variable, W, set that equal to d3.scale linear. So it's going to be a linear scale. The domain is going to be an array between 0 and d3.max. data. So d3.max is a method in D3 that pulls the largest number in the data set. So this is going to give us 42 because that's the largest number in our data set. And then .range is going to be an array between 0 and width. So this is going to rescale the bar's value to be between 0 and width. So the largest bar is going to be the full width of the SVG, and then everything else is going to be scaled appropriately based off of that large bar. Okay, so let's go and check this out. No errors. So far, so good. All right, so the next thing we want to do is apply all of these variables, the width and height at least, to the actual chart SVG element that we created in our HTML. So let's create a variable called chart and use the D3 selector to select the HTML element by the ID chart. Let's go back to our code, create a var chart variable, and then set that to be d3.select. So D3 allows you to select HTML that's already there. And you can do it by ID. So this is very similar to jQuery. You can select different elements by ID or class or element type. And then we're going to chain on attributes to this chart ID. First one is going to be width. And we're going to pass in the width value. And then attribute for height. And we're going to pass in the height value for the variables that we created up at the top. Okay, so let's check that out. Nothing's showing up, which is fine. Why don't we add a little bit of CSS as well? So I'm gonna reference the chart by ID and just give it a background color. Let's say it's gray. So now we should be able to at least see something on the screen. Cool. So we have a gray box. This is our SVG, like canvas essentially. And then we're gonna draw a bar chart inside of this. Okay. So the next thing we want to do is take that data and apply it to bars, which we're then going to draw inside of the chart. The first thing we're going to do is select the chart element that we just created, the chart variable, and then we're going to create a group for our bar chart. Then we're going to get our data and pass it into this bar. Going to create another group for each individual bar, and then we're going to position that group in the right place for where we want that bar to be. And then we're going to append a rectangle to this bar variable that we created and give it a width based off of the data, and the height is going to be just based off of the bar height variable. So back in our JavaScript, let's create a variable for bar. Set that equal to the chart variable, and then we're going to select all and create a group. Then we're going to add the data, which is the data array, and we're going to enter, pass that data into that to these methods, and we're going to append another group for each bar. Then we're going to create a attribute for transformation. We're basically moving the bar groups, the individual bar groups, where they should live and appear. And we're going to write a function by passing in the D and the iterator. D is the data. And then we're going to return the translate object. So we're just going to move this along the y-axis, so x-axis is going to be 0. Then we're going to use the iterator I times bar height. and then in the string. Then we're gonna reference that bar variable that we just created and append a rectangle to each one of these data points with an attribute for width. It's going to be based off of the data. So we're going to use a function, pass in d, which is the data point. And then we're going to return the d value, but based off of the updating the scale using the w variable that we created up at the top. So rather than getting like 4, 8, 15, this is going to scale this up so it's between the new range of 0 and width. So 4 will probably be, I don't know, 40, 8 will probably be 80, stuff like that. So the next thing we want to do is another attribute for the height of the bar. And that's just going to be bar height. And then I'm going to do -1, just so there's a little bit of padding between each bar. It's not going to be bumped up against each other. Okay, so let's see if that works. Okay, getting a translate error. Huh, so I spelled translate wrong. I'm missing an S here. So it should be translate. I seem to do that all the time. So that just goes to prove that one small error can break everything. So just missing an S for translate broke everything. Okay, so let's go back, reload. Great, so we have our bar chart. So let's say we wanted to add some text to the bar as well. We wanted to see the value, the numerical value on the bar. So we could do that. We could just append a text element to this bar group that we created, give it an X and Y position, and play around with the positioning of where the text is, and then just pass in the data value for that text. So again, let's reference bar.append, and we're appending some text. Then we have to determine where that text is going to be. So we have to give it an X and a Y. So the X is going to be based off of the data. As we want it to be at the end of the bar. And I'm just going to add some buffer, so I'm going to do -3. And then let's do an attribute for Y. And that's basically just going to be the bar height divided by 2. So it's going to be in the center of the bar. And then we could do another attribute. It's called dy, which helps us with positioning of where the text is in the middle. Let's do 0.35 ems. And the last thing we want to do is add the text. So there's a text method that allows us to pass in what text is going to show up. And I'm going to run a function because we want to pass in the data and we want to see what the data value is. Okay, so this should, great, it gives us the numbers. They're not in like the best spot though. So, and this one is completely off the screen. So we could play around with that with our CSS to make sure that the styles are appropriate. So we're basically going to go into our style document, style.css document, and we can give the rectangles a fill color of blue. And then we can give the text a fill color, a font, and text anchor end is basically going to say I want it to start flush right. So let's go to our CSS document, and then we're going to add chart rect. So all the recs that are in the chart, that are in the SVG element with the chart ID are going to be blue. Chart text, so all the text elements are going to be white. Have a font of 10 pixels and just be sans serif, whatever that is on your machine. And then text anchor, it's going to be end, so it's going to do flush right. Let's see if that works. Great, looks good. So now we can see the text. It's a contrasting color on top of the blue, which is great. Awesome. So you should have something that looks like this. It's probably going to be taller and skinnier. Okay, so we are playing around with data just as a simple array, but what if we wanted to load in an external spreadsheet like a CSV file or something like that? D3 makes that very easy for us to do as well. So there are methods for loading in CSV files, and all you have to pass in really is the name of the CSV file and where it lives. And then we're going to use a then function, a then method, so .then. And then inside of that method, we're going to pass in a function and pass in the data that we're getting from the CSV file. And everything's going to be converted to a JSON object, basically. So you can do a number of different data types. So CSV is what we're going to be using today, but you could also do d3.json if you're using JSON, d3.xml if you're using XML, TSV, HTML, and text as well. So there's lots of different options when it comes to loading in data and the type of data you're loading in. So why don't we play around with that? So if you go to the class website, info.design.danywoo.com, and go to week 11, there is an example data link that you can click on, and it's just going to download a CSV file that we could play around with. So once you've downloaded that CSV file, let's go back to our glitch project, and we're going to create a new file, and we're going to upload a file. And find that data.csv file that you just downloaded and upload it to your root directory. So this is broken into two columns rather than just one column of data. We have two columns. We have the title and a value column. So this is going to affect how we program our code as well. So we're going to have to make some modifications to the last example since we're dealing with two columns of data. So now that we have our data, let's go back to our JavaScript. And let's just go ahead and load in that data and print it out to the console to see what it looks like. So I'm going to do d3.csv. And then we're going to pass in the name of the CSV file and where it lives. Because it's in the root directory in the same folder essentially as the script.js file, we are just going to reference the name of the file, data.csv. Then we are going to use the then method and pass in a function referencing the data. Then we're just going to console log data to see what we're getting. Okay, let's go back to the stage, reload, and then in the JavaScript console, you should see all your data show up. And it should look like an array of JSON essentially. So there's an array, it has the title and the value associated to each one of those. And then it also has a columns value. And this is just the name of the columns that are in the data, title and value. So we have data, we have two different columns. Now we can start playing around with it with our bar chart. So let's go back to glitch.com. And I'm going to comment out the data that we have up here, and I'm just going to copy and paste everything inside of this function. So the reason why we have to do this is that anything that's referencing data, like here, the height divided by data.length, is not going to know that data exists unless it's inside of this function. If it's outside of this function, then data just doesn't exist and it's referencing nothing essentially. Okay, so let's see if that is doing anything. Let's reload the page. Okay, so we're getting an error. It says text attribute X expecting length, but it's getting NaN, which stands for not a number. So basically this is saying the data that it's receiving isn't a numerical value. So the reason why we're getting this is because we have two columns now. We have a title column and a value column. The value column has numerical values in it, so that's the column that we want to use when we're drawing the bar lengths, as well as positioning the text and positioning the bars. So let's go back to our script.js and let's reference that specific data point. So the first thing we need to do is change the data for the max. And we want to run a function after that. Say we're going to loop through all the data and we are going to return d.value. So this is going to return the data point in each row for the value column, which has the numerical value associated to it. So that's what we want to use when it comes to drawing the visualization, drawing the size of the bar and the position of the bar and the position of the text. That's the first thing we need to fix. Then we have to apply that to the width of the bar. So instead of just D, we have to reference which column we want to pull from. So we want to do d.value for the width of the bar. Let's see if that worked. Okay, so we got the value of the bar being applied to the width of the bar. We're still getting an error for the text, so let's go ahead and go back. Change the text to be d.value for the position. Okay. So the text is there, but it's saying it's an object, which it is. It's an object that contains both the title and the value. So we need to define that we want to display either the title or the value or both. Let's do both. So d.title, then let's separate it just by a / and then d.value. So we could have both. Great, so now we have the title and the value being displayed on top of the bar. Cool. So if you aren't using glitch.com, luckily we are, or if you're not using a web-based editor and you're running this locally on your machine, then you might come across an error that would require you to run a local server on your machine. Because we're loading in a data file, we have to do this on a web server essentially. So if you're doing this locally, you basically just have to run a simple HTTP server for the folder that contains all of your code. To do that, you just open up Terminal on the Mac and go to the root directory for where all your files live, and then type in python-m simple HTTP server to run a server, and then go to localhost 8000 and you should be fine. Since we're using glitch, that won't be an issue for this class. So the bar chart looks great, but what if we wanted to add some more stuff to it and just make it even better? Let's say we wanted to add a margin around the bar itself, so we can include like an axis at the bottom and add some other elements around the chart itself. To do that, we have to add a margin around the chart inside of the SVG element. So let's go back to our JavaScript and let's create a variable for our margin. Set that equal to top of 20, right of 30, and bottom of 30, and left of 40. So now that we have our margin, we can apply it to the width and height of the SVG element and of the bar chart inside of that SVG element. First, I'm just going to format the file so it's a little cleaner. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is subtract margin dot right and margin dot left to the width value. Do the same thing for height for margin dot top and margin dot bottom. And then in the chart variable that we created, we're going to add those back. So width is going to be plus margin dot right plus margin dot left, and height is going to be plus margin dot top and plus margin dot bottom. Okay, let's see how that looks. Okay, so we have margin around, but the bar is still stuck in the upper left-hand corner. So we need to transform the bar chart to be in the center of our SVG element. So we are going to add on to this. We're going to append a new group for the bar chart itself. And we are going to add another attribute to that group by transforming it, in other words, moving it to be in the center of that SVG element. So we're going to add in the margin dot left for the x-axis and margin dot top for the y-axis. Okay, let's see if that works. All right, so now it's center aligned based off of the margins. And you could play around with the values of the margins if you wanted to change where the position is. Now that we have some margin, some space around the bar chart itself, we have some space to add an axis. So we're going to create a variable for our axes using the axes bottom method in D3, and we're going to also add a ticks method so we can divide this axis by a certain number of ticks. And then we're just going to add this axis value to the chart as well. So we could do this at the bottom. So I'm going to create a variable for our x-axis, set that equal to a D3 element and method of axes bottom. And that's going to be based off of the W scale that we defined at the top. Then I can apply a ticks value to this as well. We can divide it by 5 ticks. Then I'm going to add that axes to the chart. So chart.append, I'm going to append it as another group, separate group. And I'm just going to add an attribute for the class. I'm going to give it a class of axes. So if we wanted to add some more styles to this, we can reference that class. I'm going to transform it so it is at the bottom of the bar chart. Translate 0 plus height plus, there we go. And then I'm going to call the axes, x-axes, that I defined at the top, or I defined above here, to apply it to this group. Okay, let's see if that works. Cool. So now we have an axis at the bottom, and you can change the style of like the lines and the tick marks. Change the number of ticks. So if we wanted this to be 10 ticks, change this to 10, and then it'll give you more ticks, which is pretty great. So now we have an axis at the bottom. So another great thing that D3 works really well for is transitions and animations. So we could have these bars animate in, starting from 0, and then animate to the actual value point. So we're going to start with nothing, and then it's going to expand to where it should be over the course of 1 second. And there's a number of different easings that we could use in D3. I'm going to use the ease bounce, which is kind of like a bounce towards the end. So we're going to do that as well. So let's go back to our JavaScript, and we're going to updating the bar value here for the rectangle. So we're going to change the rectangle to be at 0 width on load. And then over the course of 1 second, it's going to animate to the full width of the bar based off of the value. So I am going to add a new attribute here for width. Set that equal to 0. And then I'm going to say transition to this value, which is the value of the data for that bar. We should probably put the height before the transition. Just because we're not going to transition the height, it doesn't really make sense for it to be after. So we also want to add in a duration, so how long this animation is going to be. And then we can add in an easing. D3, I'm going to use the bounce easing option. So this should work. Let's try it. So on load, it animates in and does like a little bounce at the end of the animation. Looks good. So one last thing I want to show you is how to do hover states using tooltips. So first we need to create a tooltip in our JavaScript and append it to the body. We're going to append a div to the body and give it a class of tip. Then we have to give it some styles for positioning and color and basically hide it on load. So let's do that first. We could do this at the top, it's fine. Var tool tip equals d3.select body. And then we're going to append a div, and we're going to add the attribute for the class and call that class tip. All right. And let's go to our CSS and add the styles for that class. Let's give it a background color. Green is fine. You can change this however you like. Position, absolute, z-index, so it's always going to be on top of the bars. And then visibility. It's going to be hidden on load. And then we can add some padding as well. All right. So nothing's there because it's hidden, and that's how we want it to be. Great. So the next thing we need to do is activate this tooltip when you hover over the bar. So we are going to be using an on method for mouse over, mouse move, and mouse out for our rectangles on our bar chart. So let's go back to our JavaScript file and find our bar, our rectangle. So the rectangle here, we are going to add an on method for mouse over, create a function for that. And we are going to be using the data in the iterator. So D and I. And then we can return tooltip, which is referencing the variable we created at the top. Then we could apply some HTML code here. And then we also have to apply some style for the visibility. Visibility. we want it to be visible on mouse over. So for the HTML, let's just put in some basic HTML for now, and we can change that later. Say hello. Okay, let's try that, see how it goes. Okay, hover over. Okay, so when you hover over, at the bottom you can see we do get the tooltip to display on hover, but it's not in the right place. And it doesn't go away when we remove the cursor from the bar. So let's do another on. And this one is going to be mouse move. Then function, we don't need to pass in any data for this one. Return tooltip dot style, and we basically want to change the position for the top to be d3 dot event page y minus 10, just for some additional padding, plus px. And then another style for the left position, that's going to be d3 dot event dot page x plus 10 plus px. Okay, so that's for the movement. So this is basically D3 event page Y and page X is the X and Y position of your cursor. So it's going to move the tooltip based off of where your mouse is. Let's try that. Okay, looks good so far. And then if I hover off, okay, I get stuck. All right, so now we need to do a on mouse out. So on mouse out function, and we're going to return tooltip dot style visibility is going to be hidden again. Let's try that. Okay, then when we remove the cursor from the bar, it should disappear. Great. Okay, cool. So now let's say, instead of saying hello, why don't we pass in the data in that tooltip? That makes a little bit more sense. So where it says hello, I'm going to delete that and break that string apart. And we're going to add in d.title. For the title of that, for that particular row of data. Okay, so let's hover over. Great, num1, num2, num3, num4, num5, num6. Looks good. Awesome. All right, those are hover states. So there's a lot of different options when it comes to D3 beyond just bar charts. You can do line charts or stacked or pies, etc. So here are some of the layouts that you could play around with. So there's pies, stacks, forest direction, which is playing around with like, and packed, which is playing around with like node-based visualizations. There's bundles and trees and tree maps that you could also play around with. And on top of that, D3 is also really great when it comes to geographic locations and using shape files for like states or countries. There's lots of examples when it comes to chloropleth maps and centroid maps and all sorts of geographically based visualizations. So again, it's really great to look at the documentation to learn more about what is possible with D3. Look at all the examples, look at the wiki, which explains what all these different methods are and how to use them. So definitely check out the d3js.org site and then also the GitHub account for D3, which has lots of other information. And another great thing about D3 is that it's been around for a while and there's been a lot of visualizations being created using D3 over the years. Also, Mike Bostock, it's a creator, D3's creator, has done tons and tons and tons of examples, and there's lots of example code and tutorials out there. The one that is linked to off of D3's main website goes to observable.com, which is a platform that's great for sharing code, but it's also a little bit more advanced and it can be confusing for beginners. So I am linking from our class website to blocks.org, which has tons of other examples for beginners learning all about D3 visualizations. So definitely check those examples out. So why don't we check out one of these examples now? So let's go to the class website, go to week 11, and let's click on more D3 examples. So these are just a ton of different examples that you could play around with, and it just keeps on loading and loading and loading. So take a look at these. Let's click on this one, multi-line graph 2 with colors using version 5. So you have to make sure that you're using version 5 or you know what version you're using and are comfortable with it. So at the top we have the visualization itself created in D3. As we scroll down, there's some information about it. Keep on going. Has all the HTML documentation, all the HTML code here. And it also has all of the JavaScript and CSS and all the data as well. So the best thing to do is basically just copy all of this information and then kind of explore it and tweak it and modify it. Change the data if you want. So why don't we do that real quick? So I'm just going to select the CSV data and copy all of that. Let's go back to glitch, and I'm going to create a new document, new project, just a hello web page. Then I'm going to create a new file called stocks.csv and paste all that data in there. So let's go back to the example and scroll to the top. So here is the index.html file. This has all of the styles, all the CSS styles, the link to the D3 JavaScript library, then all of the JavaScript code as well. So let's just copy all of that information. Go back to glitch and go to index.html and paste that all into our index.html file. And let's show this. There we go. So in what is that, like 5-10 seconds, we got a visualization, D3 visualization working in our own file system. So now we could go back in and change the data if we wanted to. Let's make this 400. And then go back and you can see that this indeed changes the visualization. And then you could go back in and change the styles and the CSS and change the axes values, etc., etc. So that's a really great place to start if you're a beginner, is look at the examples, take those examples and modify them for your own purposes and needs. So that is all I have for you for this video. Hopefully that was interesting, and I am excited to hear more about your exploration with D3. So again, like usual, feel free to add comments in the YouTube channel, email me, or Slack me with any questions or suggestions or thoughts you might have. All right, guys, have fun with D3, and I'll talk to you later.